Right, there we go. I'm unmuted now. Welcome everyone to our Embodied Inequalities of the Anthropocene seminar series. My name's Sarah Gibbon. I'm one of the co-conveners of this international collaboration between UCL, CIESAS in Mexico and the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. Just a few practical things before I introduce today's speaker. Just to say that if you would like to get live captions for today's talk in the language of your choice, you can just turn on the feature for translated captions on your own Zoom interface. You basically have to click the globe icon at the bottom, interpretation, and select the language that you'd like closed captions in, and that will enable you to have the transcript in the language of your choice. And also just to say, there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end of the seminar via the live using the hand icon, or if you want to put your questions in the chat, feel free to do so at any point during the presentation. So I'm really delighted to welcome and introduce my friend and colleague here at UCL, Megan Vaughan. Megan is a professor of African History and Health at the Institute of Advanced Studies at UCL. She previously held positions at the University of Cambridge and Oxford and began her academic career teaching at the University of Malawi. Her interdisciplinary work has mostly focused on the history of environment, agriculture, nutrition, and gender in Malawi and Zambia. And she's also published on the history of colonial medicine and psychiatry and on slavery in the Indian Ocean. And her most recent collaborative research is funded by the Wellcome Trust, examined the social and historical aspects of chronic disease in sub-Saharan Africa. And that work came out in a UCL Press publication in 2021, Epidemiological Change and Chronic Disease in Sub-Saharan Africa. She's also currently writing a short book based on her research focusing on colonial metabolism. So we're really pleased to have Megan here to talk with us today more about this work and present her talk entitled Colonial Metabolism in Food, Nutrition and Extraction in Malawi. So over to you, Megan, and thank you very much again.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thank you for the introduction. It's lovely to see everybody. Thank you for coming at various times of day. So I'll just share my screen now. Hopefully that will work. Is that okay, everybody? Yeah, good. Okay, so I'm calling this a colonial metabolism, and I'm just going to start with two events that were in the news last year for in relation to Malawi. One pictured on the right was Cyclone Freddy, which hit southern parts of the country and Mozambique in March 2023, leaving hundreds dead and tens of thousands homeless. This was the third cyclone to hit the country since 2019. The other event, pictured on the left, occurred just a few days before the cyclone. The donation of 20,000 tons of fertilizer by a Russian chemicals company at a ceremony in the capital Lilongwe, attended by the Russian ambassador to the tune of the Russian national anthem. Much of this fertilizer, already delivered late in the season, was quickly washed away. I'll get back to both of these events briefly at the end of the paper. I'll just begin now with an outline of the paper I'm going to present. I begin with a brief socio-political description of colonialism in Malawi, as I realize some people may not be, very well acquainted with that part of the world. The main part of the paper relies heavily on the work of colonial nutritional scientists who conducted a large survey, agricultural, social, and nutritional, in Malawi in the late 1930s. So I revisit and dig into their papers and also my own previous research to discuss two very specific aspects of what I'm calling a colonial metabolism. And those are, firstly, the importance of fermentation, particularly the role of beer, and secondly, the place of small animals and insects in sustaining human life. In both cases, the biological and social dimensions are inseparable. And finally, and I'm aware with probably not very much time, I want to reflect on what I've called a Monsanto biometabolism that now dominates the food system in Malawi, and reflect on its doubtful sustainability and the possible alternatives to it. So first of all, a few just locating slides. So Malawi is a kind of narrow strip of a country in, sometimes it's referred to as being in central southern Africa, sometimes it's being referred to as being in East Central Africa, but you can see roughly where it is there. And its basic facts here is it's a former British colony. It's got a population of around 19 million and is by African standards very densely populated, although not highly urbanized by comparison to some of its neighbors. 85% of the population derive their main livelihood from agriculture. Most of that is smallholder agriculture. And the size of land holdings has become very small. The mean size is 0.65 hectares. 50% or more of people live below the national poverty line. It is often referred to as one of the poorest countries in Africa. And it is a rain-fed agriculture, one season a year, so very vulnerable to climate shocks. Let me begin by explaining my interest in metabolism as a biological and socioeconomic and ecological concept. I became interested in the concept of metabolism when my colleagues and I were researching the ways in which biomedicine approached changes in the epidemiology of communities in Central Southern Africa, particularly the increase in so-called non-communicable diseases and metabolic disorders. Interrogating the dominant discourses on so-called lifestyle diseases as they were applied to poorer communities in Africa, and examining some of the longer-term factors of work led me to revisit and update my own research on colonialism, gender, environmental change, and food systems in the region, and to discover how many issues I had missed through my own biases and by not always listening to people properly. I also wanted to think through some of the urgent issues facing rural people and policymakers in Malawi, including debates over the sustainability and health consequences of the food system and the wider questions of how a growing global population can be fed well in the context of the climate emergency. Metabolism does seem to be having something of a moment. As a modern biological concept referring to chemical reactions and energy exchanges in living cells, it's usually dated to the early 19th century. And in early iterations, its equations of energy flows, waste, and growth in part reflected the material context of industrialization in Europe. At a socio-ecological register, the idea of metabolism was taken up by Marx in his theory of metabolic rift, in which he described how humans transform nature through their labor and how modern agriculture exhausted the capacities of the soil and disrupted the cycles of food, energy, waste that had sustained rural communities. In the context of recent debates on the Anthropocene, Marx's metabolic rift theory has been taken up again and widely discussed in a critical political ecology literature, examining the consequences of the industrial intensification of agriculture, the deepening exploitation of nature, and the uneven impacts of these processes, particularly in relation to colonialism and its aftermaths. Meanwhile, however, the metabolism of contemporary bioscience has moved on, now drawing on research in immunology, epigenetics, and stress biology, as well as biochemistry. This work is less concerned with mechanistic flows of food, energy, growth, and waste, and more with signaling processes at the cellular level, and crucially, the profound impact on our endocrinal systems of exposure to harmful chemicals in the environment, including in our industrialized food. And here I'm depending very heavily on the wonderful work of Hannah Landecker on all of these issues. And as she puts it, in the new post-industrial metabolic age, food is seen less as fuel than as a source of exposure. Thinking with the concept of metabolism seemed attractive because I wanted to work at different but connected scales and to take biology seriously as part of a socio-ecological and historical analysis. So in this paper, I'm proposing that the colonial system in Malawi was characterized by a particular metabolism operating from the level of political economy through to the gut's microbiome, and that its sustainability, always in question, relied heavily on what Laura Ann Twagira, in a very different context, calls embodied engineering. I'm drawing too on the work of Anna Singh and her colleagues that brings attention to what they call the patchy Anthropocene, a spatial as well as temporal analysis that highlights the relationship between the large-scale processes of modular simplification, monocultures, for example, and the spaces in between, where sometimes surprising, what they call feral proliferations occur. Though the 19th century scientific theories of metabolism as a system of energy production and extraction are outdated in modern scientific terms, nevertheless, the exploitation of energy in one form or another was central to colonial and imperial systems. Catherine Yusuf, in her book, Obsidian and Black Anthropocenes, calls this the racialized equations of energy extraction. But colonial metabolisms took a variety of forms. Unlike some of the settler colonialisms around the world that destroyed at will indigenous people, knowledge systems, ecologies, the one I'm describing, and many more like it, works parasitically. And here I sort of link this to the work of Nancy Fraser and her book, Cannibal Capitalism. Unable and often unwilling to totally remake societies and environments, it remained dependent on the knowledge, labours, and liveliness of the very people whose claims to be human it so often denied. The colonial metabolism in Malawi was parasitic then on people, plants, and living creatures, and often balanced on a knife edge. Operating at different scales simultaneously, from the voracious appetite for labour of the industrial system of South Africa, through the extraction of energy and fertility of women's bodies, to the complex interactions of soils, insects, and microbial lives on which everyone depended, colonialism in this context did not result in overnight destruction, but operated through a kind of slow burning violence. And I'm reminded here, of course, of Rob Nixon's book, now 10 years old, called Slow Violence, or the Environmentalism of the Poor. In colonial Malawi, where the economic, if not the political rationale for colonization was dubious, even to some of its agents, the need to establish a durable system of extraction became clear almost as soon as the imperial lines had been drawn on the map. This is a country that lacks mineral resources, and the political economy of the country depended on three separate but interacting processes of extraction. Firstly, there was the extraction of male migrant labor to the mines and energetic economy of Southern Africa, directly contributing to imperial capitalism. Secondly, the establishment of a small but influential local community of white settlers, who acquired land and were backed up by the colonial authorities and whose own usually inept attempts at commercial agriculture were subsidized by the state and in turn funded by the taxation of the Malawian population. And finally, in some areas of Malawi, farmers were encouraged to grow cash crops such as cotton under carefully controlled conditions, which was sold through government buyers at fixed prices. All parts of this extractive economy, though they focused really largely on men, rested on the intensification of women's labour in one form or another, including their reproductive labour, both biological and social, and the intensified exploitation of natural resources, soils, plants, animal life. The sustainability of this system was questioned by some colonial observers from the very beginning of British rule in the late 1890s, and for a while shared concerns about low human fertility rates and social breakdown produced a kind of pro-natalist alliance between colonial administrators and male African elders, both lamenting the decline of traditional systems of authority and the alleged uncontrollability of women. In the worst case scenario, and that was the spectre of what had happened in the Belgian Congo, the very biological viability of the population might be in doubt. And there were disagreements in the colonial administration itself over the desirability of male labor migration outside the colony. Attention turned to food production, since the entire system of extraction rested on the ability of rural communities to feed themselves and simultaneously supply additional labor. Enter here the colonial scientists. In the 1930s, and there's quite a lot of literature on this now, the practitioners of the new science of nutrition were in full swing in Britain's African colonies. With their tape measures and baby scales, they weighed, measured, prodded, and computed the physiological consequences of colonialism. They worked with a fairly mechanistic view of human metabolism centered on nutrition, energy equations, and growth, but one increasingly influenced by advances in biochemistry and associated knowledge of the importance of vitamins and other micronutrients. In the late 1930s, an ambitious scientific survey was conducted in Malawi, known as the Nyasaland Nutrition Survey. Its multidisciplinary team focused on 3 villages in different ecological zones to measure food production and intake and energy expenditure as a level of detail that I think has never been completely reproduced in the country. Underlying this research was a concern that colonial Malawians were undernourished, obviously an assumption, and in particular that their diets lacked protein, which was a very fashionable subject of interest in the 1930s, and also an essential vitamin, B3 or niacin. It was an exercise in colonial science with all that that implies in terms of attitudes to its subjects. But the data it produced were nevertheless extensive, and some of the results challenged the researchers' own preconceptions. So I'll just summarize some of the findings here. The survey revealed that the colonial metabolism of Malawi was marked by the uneven, but in some places highly significant absence of what they called able-bodied men, 70% in one of the villages surveyed. And this meant women's labour was intensified and greatly stretched. After extensive research, the colonial nutritionists concluded that the largely vegetarian rural Malawian diet was actually quite well balanced, but there was just simply not enough of it in quantity. The vast majority of the protein intake came from vegetable sources, as it does today. And the conclusion, which was quite controversial at the time was that if the intake of calories was sufficient, then and I'm quoting here, the protein would take care of itself. Seasonal variations in intake were very marked, but there were also daily ups and downs due to a large degree to the work burdens of women and their social arrangements. The researchers were witnessing not overt starvation, but a slow process of depletion and exhaustion at the level of soils, vegetation, animal life, and the human body. Central to the functioning of this rural metabolism and its viability was the labor of women, which I don't have time to go into in great detail, but I can talk about. Their knowledge of the local ecology and their flexible practices. Also critical were the activities of children and the gender knowledge that had passed down to them. So in the next two sections of the paper, I'm going to draw on the results of the survey and some of my other research to discuss just two aspects of the socio-ecological system that made this colonial metabolism viable, albeit with a marked degree of precarity. The first is what I'm calling gut resistance. Sorry. Long before kimchi and kefir became staples for middle-class consumers in the post-industrial global north, rural people all over the world, as I'm sure you all know, used fermentation to process and preserve their food. Recent research on the importance of the gut microbiome for human health has led to a new appreciation and enthusiastic marketization, indeed hype, of these traditional fermented foods, often packaged as health products and blurring the Western distinction between food and medicine. Consumers on the African continent are not immune to the nostalgic appeal and alleged health benefits of industrially produced traditional fermented or formerly fermented products. So in South Africa, for example, versions of amasi, which is a traditional fermented milk, are widely sold in supermarkets. In Malawi, a commercialized version of traditional beer, chibuku, has been marketed successfully for over 50 years, along with maheu on the right of that slide, which is a non-alcoholic maize drink, also based on a fermented local product, but now heavily sweetened and flavored with vanilla, strawberry, or chocolate, and fortified with vitamins. In Zimbabwe, chibuku beer, made for brothers, is explicitly advertised as representing sharing, friendship, and cultural values. It's packaged in large cartons, and like traditional beers, assumed to be passed around from male person to male person after the obligatory shake, shake recommended on the carton. Bottle beers are, by definition, for those people unwilling to share. Amongst other qualities, the gut microbiome plays an important part in our immune systems and our ability to synthesize vitamins and nutrients. Researchers in Malawi once thought that the apparently underdeveloped microbiota of children treated for severe acute malnutrition were a consequence of the malnutrition, but now some view it as a possible cause. Most likely, the relationship is complex and multi-directional and closely related to poverty and living conditions, including infectious disease in particular. The gut microbiome of African populations has become a somewhat fashionable subject for research and experimentation. Well, although there is a lot of hype around this area, I do want to argue that fermentation and the human gut microbiome that the process supported played a part in the ability of Malawians to adapt biologically to the demands of the colonial economy. And that might sound a bit kind of exaggerated, but I think it is true. More particularly, the widespread consumption of one fermented food, beer, was critical to the maintenance of health. The colonial system, you could say, was parasitic on this economy of fermentation. But gut microbes do not act alone. As the manufacturers of Chibuku are so clearly aware, fermentation is also about sociability and exchange. The vitamin that most concerned the colonial nutritionists when they began work in Malawi in the late 30s was B3 or niacin, a lack of which can cause a serious deficiency disease, pellagra. In the past, Malawian villagers had grown indigenous millet and sorghum as their staples, but these crops had been edged out by maize, originated in the Americas, and that had spread gradually to this part of Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries along trade routes. Maize had gained ground in large part because it was such a productive, high-yielding crop, and it also could be adjusted to different ecological zones. But it had two drawbacks. Firstly, it was very greedy for nutrients, especially nitrogen, leaving soils vulnerable when they were overworked. And secondly, maize lacks B3. Pellagra was known to be common in other populations with maize-based diets. And since 2 of the 3 survey villages in Malawi depended very heavily on maize as their staple crop, it seemed reasonable to assume that they might suffer from this deficiency. But this assumption was challenged by the results of the nutritionists' research. It's not to say that the nutritionists were wrong to be worried. Achieving a healthy diet under the new circumstances required both the deployment of inherited knowledge and the creation of new knowledge on the part of rural people, an ability and willingness to adapt, the reinforcement and utilization of social networks, and increasingly an agile engagement with the market. And inevitably, not everyone managed this balancing act, but fermentation definitely helped. Beer was the most conspicuous fermented food in the Malawian villagers' diet, although not the only one. An analysis of its nutritional contribution produced some staggering results. Beer brewing had a pronounced seasonality connected to its social and economic role. At the height of the rainy agricultural season, around 35% of the calorie intake of working men came from beer, of which a third was from the alcohol. Over the year as a whole, that percentage was 16%. In one of many concessions to so-called local knowledge, colonial nutritionists concluded that, I quote, "the native conception of beer as a food is a true one." This was in part because it provided not only calories, but bacteria and yeasts, the source of valuable B vitamins. The nutritional benefits of the beer derive from the different stages of the brewing process, from the initial germination of the grain used as a malt, which allowed a synthesis of the B vitamins, to the final process of fermentation, which fixed and preserved the vitamins, to additional fermentation that took place inside the body. In short, beer was vital in preventing serious nutritional deficiencies in colonial Malawian villages. It was women's knowledge that determined the success of the transformation of food through the action of microorganisms. They might not know about B3, but they knew when a beer brew was successful. Beer also meant readily absorbable calories, and these were needed by the gendered, energetic economy of villages now heavily impacted by the extraction of male labor. At the peak of the agricultural season, when male labor was most in demand, Communal labour parties were the most efficient way of getting heavy tasks done quickly. This communal burst of labour was literally unthinkable without the provision of beer. Beer was the most obvious product of fermentation in the diets of Malawian villages, but it's not the only one. In cattle-keeping areas of northern Malawi, people drank and drink a sour milk known as chambiko. In the 1930s, the processing of both of Malawi's main staples, maize and cassava, also involved fermentation. Cassava, as you know, originates in the Americas and has a long history in Africa associated initially with the Atlantic slave trade. In Malawi, it comes in sweet and bitter varieties, the latter more high yielding than the former, but also high in poisonous hydrogen cyanide. The lengthy process of cassava flour preparation learned by generations of Malawian women, peeling, cutting, grating the roots, repeated soakings, squeezing, drying in the sun, was essential to the safe removal of the poison and produced a fermented flour that was made into a porridge known in northern parts of the country as kondowole. Women still process bitter cassava in this way in Malawi. Also, the exhaustive process of producing maize flour from the harvested crop included repeated periods of soaking and drying, entailing degrees of germination and fermentation. When women embarked on the 4 to 5 day process of producing a batch of flour, they began with using the water that had been used to soak the previous batch, known as chisungu, to soak the grain. At later stages in the process, fragments of grain were soaked again and left to dry. Each fragment of maize at each stage had its own name. Partly germinated fragments, bits of bran, recalcitrantly hard fractions were boiled and eaten as snacks by the women and girls, helping to compensate for the extraordinary amounts of energy that went into producing the final product, a fine white flour, which was fit to be served publicly as an eating group. So I suppose this is a very rough of my notes on the various stages drawn from the work of the 1930s nutritionists on the various stages of maize processing, the different names given to different bits and pieces of maize and maize products in that process. The fermentation of cereals, including maize, improves the accessibility of nutrients, making it easier to digest plant proteins and to absorb vital minerals. And there's some indication that these benefits cannot be entirely replicated by the now common practice of biofortification. In Malawi today, the widespread use of hammer mills and of industrially produced maize flour has eliminated germination and fermentation from the country's main staple food. It's hard to know exactly what the consequences of this are for gut health, immune systems, and the long list of other benefits now attributed to a healthy gut microbiome. And in any case, this has to be weighed against the significant amounts of women's labour saved by milling. Even vocal advocates of African food processing and storage techniques as forms of indigenous knowledge recognize that they're usually very demanding of women's labour. In rural Malawi in the 1930s, the pressure on women's labour was intense. Time spent preparing and processing food was sometimes time away from producing that food or patiently feeding small children, without mentioning other ways in which women might want to use their time. Nevertheless, it is clear that the nutrition and health of rural people depended in part at least on those living processes of germination and fermentation taking place both inside and outside the body. In the case of beer, some of these benefits were directly measurable as availability of B vitamins, compensating for the increasing dependence of Malawians on maize as a staple food deficient in niacin, and protecting them against developing pellagra. Beer, perhaps more than any other food, demonstrated the dependence of the colonial system on a functioning local metabolism in which the social and the biological were one. Beer brought pleasure, brought communities together, motivated and numbed the pain of hard agricultural work, allowed women access to male incomes, and the body access to vital nutrients. How much time have I got? Let me just, okay. So I'm just going to go on to my next section, and that's really the final section before the conclusion. And this is a section on insects, small animals, and boys. As my Malawian colleague Elias Mandala showed in his brilliant account of food and eating in the Lower Shiri Valley of Malawi, there's no way to understand what came to be known as nutrition without understanding the social organization of eating and the many complex ways in which food is distributed and redistributed at the point of eating. Focusing on food availability and a calculation of nutritional needs and energy expenditure could only get you so far. Malawian villages in the 1930s, and to some extent now, ate their meals in groups structured by age and gender, sharing and redistributing food at the point of consumption. And in this section, I want to focus on one group of people who rarely sat down to eat and who consistently thwarted the scientists' attempts at quantification. This group consisted of young boys. Following them from the village into the surrounding fallow land, field edges, woodland, and rivers tells us a lot about the biodiversity that underpinned rural diets and the supply of protein to growing bodies. It tells us too about the interdependence of different forms of life that compose the metabolic system. So up until the age of around 5, small boys spent most of their time playing in the village alongside the girls. But from pretty early on, the gendered nature of play was evident. Girls, almost as soon as they could stand on their feet, were learning how to manipulate a pounding pestle and a winnowing basket, as well as how to carry a baby on their back and stir a stiff pot of porridge or nsima. Boys, meanwhile, were learning to work wood into hoe handles and bows and arrows and how to set traps. Between the ages of 6 and 14, they were apparently often absent from the family meal. And if you only counted what they ate in the village, you would conclude they were starving. In Malawi, in the Malawian study, the free-ranging eating habits of boys were most extreme in the case of the cattle-keeping ethnic group of the Ngoni. Here, boys were put in charge of cattle at a very early age and left very much to their devices as far as food was concerned, which meant that they were largely eating what they could find as they drove their cattle around looking for pasture. And what they found were wild foods, insects, small animals, supplemented by the occasional theft of maize cobs and bananas, as well as gifts of food from neighboring villages. Boys were particularly active in trapping or collecting small animals and insects, and the list of small mammals caught and eaten by children, and to a lesser extent by adults, was impressively long, including porcupines, a wide range of rats and mice, and identified by local names. They were also known by the locations in which they could be found, in underground burrows, in the stems of banana plants or holes in tree trunks, or in the case of the tiny kamkoko, living in the cobs and leaves of maize plants. The interdependence of humans, other animal life, and vegetation could not have been clearer in this naming system. Sometimes the catches were brought home to the village. So in the dry months of September and October, when fresh food was hard to come by for the indiwo, or the relish that was eaten with the porridge, boys were praised by their mothers for bringing their catch of mice back into the village to be cooked. But much of the foods collected, trapped, hunted, or stolen by young boys was actually eaten by them in situ, making up for missing calories, particularly in the lean season, but also presumably providing important protein, vitamin, and micronutrient supplementation. In addition to small animals, they also were very active and knowledgeable about insects. On the right of the screen is a termite heap. As you may know, termites, and there are hundreds of species of them in Malawi, are highly nutritious, containing a lot of protein and fat and phosphates, and also having a central role in the rural metabolic system, providing food for small animals, birds, and humans, pollinating plants, recycling nutrients, and helping to maintain soil fertility. To get a bit of a sense of the importance of insects from the colonial survey, which they couldn't really count them, I was very struck by one of the sort of diaries of food intake from that survey, which showed in 1938 a poor household of 3 adults and 3 children, who one day just ate one very meager meal because they only had wild leaves to eat with their porridge. And so the women, as often was the case, concluded that it really wasn't worth the effort of cooking much of that porridge. And so on that day, the total calorie consumption of the whole group was measured as 3,700. But the very next day, when the boys came home with white ants, it was close to 11,000. And the women explained that this was because the white ants were so delicious that they then decided they would, after all, make the effort to cook more than one helping of porridge. So let me just end with some concluding thoughts. Small animals, insects, and the gut-enhancing microbes of fermented foods were integral to the Malawian rural diet in the 1930s, along with mushrooms, wild green leaves, fruits, and tubers. Though some of these foods, like termites, were eaten with relish, others, like the stinking caterpillar, were consumed more reluctantly. The biodiversity represented by these foods is striking and indicative of both a rich ecology and knowledge system. It's important to remember, though, that colonial Malawians were not enthusiastic vegans, and older people today still lament the diminished role of meat in their diets, at the same time as they mock the present-day practices of chicken rearing too fast, and worry about the impact of artificial fertilizers and pesticides on their health. It's quite possible, though hard to establish, that the extensive use of gathered foods, small animals, and insects in the 1930s was greater than it had been in the past, and was actually an indication of stress. Not, in other words, although a traditional, if you like, system, it was perhaps even more important in this period than it had been in the past. But it is clear that this aspect of the food system that acted as an underpinning of the larger colonial metabolism has continued to play an essential role, despite the destruction of woods and forests and the practices of monoculture that have eroded the spaces in which mice, termites, birds, and caterpillars live. In the famine of the early 2000s, as in the late colonial famine of 1949, communities survived on a variety of wild foods for months after their grain stores had become empty. And it's widely documented that children in Malawi still collect, eat, and sell insects and small mammals. So there are good reasons to admire the diversity and versatility of the food system. The occurrence of periodic famines is a reminder of its precarity. With a population of over 19 million today, compared to an estimated 1.5 million in the late 1930s, food security remains a critical issue. Most households have no hope of being food self-sufficient, owing to the small size of their land and its increasing degradation. There is little alternative viable employment in the country. Impressive health interventions, meanwhile, mean that many fewer babies and small children die of nutrition-related disease. So that is a huge success. But Malawi still has an unenviable reputation for what is called the stubbornness of its statistics for stunting. The famine of the early 2000s threatened political stability and spurred a long overdue investment in small farm agriculture. However, this investment has not, for the most part, built on the inherited dietary and agricultural knowledge of Malawians, but took the form of subsidizing the use of imported artificial fertilizer and hybrid seeds provided by the agro-industrial giants and Bayer, previously Monsanto. The results in terms of productivity are disputed. There's a highly polarized debate between advocates of the system and those who see themselves more as agroecologists. It's actually very difficult to compare data, but they don't cite each other. But what we do know is that this new system has entailed a massive simplification of the diet, despite the fact in some ways it looks very similar to the past, and a loss of biodiversity, a modular simplification and things terminology. There has been, it's important to say, no large-scale famine since the introduction of these policies, but the environmental and health consequences of the new metabolic system are significant, and its sustainability, both financial and environmental, is now in serious doubt, especially with the war in Ukraine and the increased fertilizer prices. There is a policy shift taking place in Malawi, but it remains to be seen what the outcome is going to be. One of the poorest countries in Africa has been at the frontier of a bio-agro-industrial transformation on the continent, supported by Western donors and foundations such as Gates. And now it appears also as a pawn, albeit a rather minor one, in the new Cold War between Russia and Western allies for influence on the African continent, hence the donation of the fertilizer. Advocates of agroecological methods look back on the time when Malawian diets and agriculture were marked by greater diversity and an imagined harmony with the natural world, hoping that there can still be some healing of the metabolic rift. Perhaps they are over-nostalgic, but they also have a point. If the amount of investment that has gone into this fertilizer, hybrid seed, monocultural metabolic system had gone into sustainable agricultural methods, then maybe the latter would be more than able to compete in terms of productivity gains to feed a growing population. At the other end of the spectrum, startups across the continent looked at the industrialization of insect production as one way to fill the continent's present and anticipated protein gap and to fulfill the climate change objectives to which African countries are being directed. Perhaps genetically engineered insects or lab-grown meat represent the new frontier of a post-colonial metabolic system, an eco-modernist dream or a nightmare, depending on your perspective. And finally, there is the real nightmare of Cyclone Freddy, like the return of the repressed, in which past and present are compressed into a few days of death and destruction as the cumulative consequences of the long-term overexploitation of the planet wreaks havoc on the lives of those least responsible for that exploitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan, for that really fascinating talk. I think so much to think with and think through, both historically and the contemporary questions that you raise at the end there as well, which are really incredibly pressing. So yes, it's wonderful that we have a bit of time now to just discuss a little bit more some of these ideas and the contexts that you're working in. So just to encourage everybody to put up your hand or to put your question in the chat. Maybe I can start because I can't see anybody's hand up just yet. I just wanted to push you a little bit, Megan, on this, I mean, this very compelling concept of colonial metabolism. And I think it's really fascinating in the paper that so this is a project of extraction and exploitation, but obviously moves beyond a simplistic idea of extraction or resistance, and the way of aligning with things, patchy Anthropocene and feral proliferations is really clear. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about what this focus on metabolism enables you here that other critical accounts don't. You talked a little bit about the Marxist idea of metabolic rift, other accounts of colonial capitalism and impacts on food, health and bodies. And I think what's really interesting is this idea of colonial metabolism as being parasitic and dependent on local metabolisms and these economies and practices of fermentation and nutrition that you talk about as part of that sustained local metabolism. So I suppose that's one part of the question. And the other part of the question is about the dangers of the concept as well, and thinking about that that colonial metabolism centers the biological or points to some sort of universal kind of notion, maybe. And then the question, which I think comes up in other people's work as well, around people like Amber Benazra's work on, kind of the African population, the research focus on African populations' guts, and that kind of being the dangers of that. I mean, Benazra talks about race as this kind of ghost variable in that research. So I'm just thinking more about the sort of what this opens up, this concept, and then also what you might see as some of the dangers of using it as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, on the dangers, I suppose any theory that kind of, I mean, the attraction of working with the idea of metabolism for me, I didn't want to just work with it as a metaphor. I wanted to try and actually kind of put together different levels of analysis in a way that I think does kind of hang together. So I did, I mean, the whole point about it is that it's not purely a biological concept. It's also, and many other people use it, it's not just me, using it in a way that is much more expansive. And you're right that then you can end up with something that just explains everything or seems to contain everything, and there's no chinks in it. But I think as long as you're sort of aware of that danger, I think it did seem to me that there was something actually happening metabolically in this particular instance that I could pinpoint in biological terms, which was also part of huge changes to the social system. So I mean, I'm not going to claim it's like a theory to explain everything. It's just, I hope I'm not just sort of flippantly kind of using this term, that I am actually thinking about it seriously, but I wouldn't want to sort of say this is a theory that explains everything. But it does take me back to, when I was a PhD student studying Southern African history, we were all Marxists. I mean, it seems like very strange now, but that's what we were brought up with. And in many ways, what I've gone back to here is a kind of, it is familiar to me as we all talked about the different ways in which extraction took place within these colonial economies, and the fact that extraction could be slow. When you looked at the extraction taking place in male labor in the gold mines in South Africa, but you also looked at the women who were left behind in the labor supplying areas, and you thought about the different forms of extraction and resistances to those forms of extraction. So in some ways it is going back to that, but I think the biological element, or what, I don't like using the word biological, but that kind of level of extraction, it just does seem to me to be important and interesting. And it was something that the colonial scientists were very aware of, actually, and were thinking about. So, yeah, I sort of feel like the title is good. It's a good title, colonial metabolism, isn't it? But whether I can actually really live up to it is another matter. But what I'm focusing on here is a particular type of extraction that doesn't destroy everything. And it deliberately doesn't destroy everything, if you like, because it can't, colonialism can't live without those systems actually continuing to function. So that kind of parasitic economy, I think, as Nancy Fraser generalizes it much more to the capitalist system, I think is at work here.
Thanks, Megan. I mean, I wasn't suggesting this, you were kind of presenting as a universal model at all, but I think it is, yeah, it's really interesting to think about how it can be applied to specific contexts, and those details can then illuminate those dynamics in much more fully in specific contexts. Great. Well, we'll move on. We've got some at least one hand up. I can see Andrew. Is it right? Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks so much for your paper. I thought it was really fascinating. And my question is also just on this concept of colonial metabolism and I guess its kind of parameters. I found it really interesting and persuasive. I'm a historian, so I'm kind of interested in its relationship, I suppose, to kind of historical chronology and time, and also sort of thinking about it in relationship to the concept which kind of frames the seminar, right? The Anthropocene. And I wondered like what you thought the relationship in terms of time between colonial metabolism and the Anthropocene. It seems that a lot of where you sort of date it from seems to come from the 19th century, which is quite sort of complementary to the Anthropocene, and where a lot of people would date that from coming from as well. But I was also interested in this idea of kind of slow depletion, I think you called it, which was really interesting. And I think what was persuasive about it was kind of these longer term, sort of almost kind of invisible processes that you really need to look at it over a longer term to see. But then I suppose I was thinking, like, how slow is the slow depletion that you're describing if you sort of think about the broad sweep of kind of ecological and geological change, even just dating it from the 19th century to the 1930s when the survey was taking place. That's quite a quick time frame in the grand sweep of things. So yeah, just some questions there about kind of chronology and time, and sort of how you're thinking about that with the concept.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I should say that there are lots of people who refer to slow, violent, slow depletion, including my colleague Naomi Toussillon, who wrote about slow extraction, and I think in the paper I do cite her for that term. So I think that the historical question is really interesting, because what I need to avoid what I do avoid doing in the longer sort of versions that I'm writing is saying, oh, there's a kind of baseline we can go back to, which is a sort of harmonious African ecological, economic, social system. And then there's all this disruption that comes with colonialism. I actually can't do that. I mean, I can, because of, although I have studied that kind of, especially in the 19th century, in fact, there was so much disruption in this region, at least from the 18th century onwards, from the long distance trading networks and the slave trade, that by the time the colonial system, the colonial system comes in, that these societies are already, at least some of them, in crisis. And then there's another kind of set of crises produced by colonial conquest and new diseases and so on. So the 1930s is, if you like, when things are sort of settling down into this slow extractive model, but people have barely had time actually to re-establish themselves from the days of the slave regime and the conflict that was across the region. And so it's not as if there is a sort of something to look back to. I mean, you know, you can look back further and speculate about what these, there is a little bit of archaeological work and there are oral traditions and so on. So, but you're right that some of these processes are happening over a long period, and some of them are these rather rapid shifts that take place, or rapid responses. So, for example, something like the First World War produces a huge effect, you know, because people from this area are forcibly recruited as porters to go and carry the goods into the German territories. People die in huge numbers. There's an epidemic of flu afterwards. And, you know, there are these moments of kind of crises. There are political responses to that. And there are moments where the extractive economy meets that political resistance. There are rebellions precisely against the impossibility of meeting those extractive demands at the sort of family level, you know, and much of that resistance takes kind of religious political form in the early periods, and then becomes more, you know, proto-nationalist as we go on. So there are all sorts of things here that I can't. But they are connected, you know. I mean, people's sort of awareness of what is happening to their bodies and their health and their reproduction. And then the other thing that is also happening is that men come back from the mines disabled or disoriented. You know, I know that from other work I've done, which is another kind of impact. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think so in the longue durée in this region, the irony, if you like, is that this was a region that attracted people. We know over the centuries, people migrated to this region because it had a varied ecology, it was relatively fertile, it had good water supply, it's somewhere where people came. And it was that, if you like, that fertility that first attracted the elephant hunters, the slave raiders, and so on. So there is definitely another level of yeah, there's a different kind of temporality, other levels, and it's good to be reminded of that. You know, thank you.
Great. I think we have a question from Jenny. I think you might be on mute, Jenny.
There, okay. Hi, thanks so much, Megan. That was really, really, really interesting. And of course, quite a lot of it, you know, I'm thinking like cross-culturally here. And of course, you know, I work with populations who also process maize and where women spend a lot of their time processing maize. And so I just found that your descriptions of how the gendered division of labor occurs around food really interesting. But also not just the gendered division of labor, but the gendered division of nutrition. So if these, particularly in your descriptions of the young boys who are going off and they're coming back and they're getting, how does that play out in terms of, you know, a more generalized sort of health status, well-being? How does that, I mean, those really quite dramatic differences in the nutritional intake of boys and girls at quite a young age, and as they, I'm not sure what sort of ages you're talking, you know, it goes up to, but what does that look like as they reach adulthood, and how does it define or reproduce, if you know, these sort of gendered roles?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I don't have, if you like, a kind of biological answer to that. I mean, there were some of the researchers did produce growth charts of children. So it is possible to look at the growth charts and compare those growth charts to other, in fact, they were comparing them to other children in other places. And also looking at age of puberty, which is the kind of indicator of, well, you know, is at least related to nutritional, to nutrition. I mean, I think what, it's hard to know exactly how to answer that question. I mean, what is interesting is that, is very evident, is that when people sit down for a communal meal, it is the men who get the best bits of the protein. So it's the best bits that go towards them, and everybody says that. And even people I've interviewed more recently, the older men would say, "Oh, we were really terribly selfish in the old days because we always used to shake meat." You know, but women, to some extent, and girls, to some extent, made up for that by snacking during while they were preparing the food. So that is also recorded by the Malawians who are actually collecting this data, not the white people, you know, the same way as happens today. So they're compensating by, as they call it, snacking, as they produce the food. But there's definitely a perception that most of the protein is quite gendered, and the protein is very male oriented, particularly if it's, and there isn't a lot of meat or fish, but that's, you know, there's a definite bias there. The boys eventually do come back in the sense, I mean, then they can't possibly be absent the entire time. I mean, I don't believe that. It's just that they're often not there when the family is sitting down for the communal meal, but they are obviously coming and going from the village and picking up food from their households, I would have thought. But then they do come back when they're adolescents. They reach a different stage, and they sleep separately with other adolescents, and then they start being fed by the women in the same way as the adult men are. So it's a particular period when they're absent, they're more absent.
Yeah, I was specifically.
It's like teenagers grazing from refrigerators.
I was specifically thinking about sort of the impact of the food that they graze, as in the insects, the rodents, this other types of foraging.
I mean, calcium,
sort of
protein, quite a lot. Good stuff, although they obviously needed the carbohydrates too. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sarah, there's a question from Ivana. Would you like us to read that out? Yeah. So Ivana's asked, she says, I'm working with small cattle breeders in southern Brazil. I've found data pointing to forms of resistance to nutritional colonialism, but consciously as a form of health protection. For example, the small cattle breeders don't eat meat from the supermarket. They will feed the animals that will be consumed by the family with less medicine and more corn or manioc, etc. I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit more about these forms of resistance to colonial metabolism.
Yeah, that's interesting. In the sort of present day, I suppose I can sort of attempt to talk about that. I think there is a real anxiety, which seems to me to be quite generalizable across the region, and certainly I've been doing a bit of work with colleagues in Ghana, so in West Africa too, about the current food system. And there's definitely a sense that it's becoming unsafe. And that's probably less acute in Malawi than it is in some other places that have gone further down the route of processed foods and so on. People, as I think I mentioned briefly in the paper, people really are worried about pesticides, as they should be, I think, because they're just not properly controlled in the country. It's not as extreme as those vignettes from Guatemala that Emily, is it? Oh gosh, I've forgotten her, who wrote that book on the weight of obesity. You know,
Emily Yates Door.
Emily, it's you know, the idea that it's actually safer
I
to
know her, yeah.
safer to feed your kids there's the American processed food than it is to give them a carrot that you've grown in the ground. I don't think it's as cute as that, but I think there is a bit of resistance, and the idea that I mean, the fact that people laugh a lot about chickens is a kind of bitter sort of laughter, because they're just saying this is ridiculous. You know, these chickens are being reared far too quickly. What, you know, how can they possibly be okay? There's something wrong with them. And there is this discourse of everything being made to grow too quickly in an artificial way that is distorting everything. But to be absolutely frank, so many people are so food insecure that they really don't have much choice. So if you're at the bottom of the socioeconomic pile in Malawi, and I know from following people around that it's like a daily struggle to work out where you're going to get your food from, and you are literally trying to find where you can find something cheap to get to contribute to your daily meal. So, and in that sense, people are extremely flexible. And if they find some beans, you know, on the market, look a bit cheaper than other beans, and you know, but it is a daily thing. So it's very difficult, except for people who are a bit better off. It's very difficult for them to make food choices, really meaningful food choices. Yeah. And then I think, as I said, there is a desire for more meat. The fact that people are largely vegetarian doesn't mean they want to be. And people think back very nostalgically to a distant past where there were more animals and more meat to be eaten. And that's what makes Southern or much of Africa a big market for, say, Brazilian chicken producers and others, because there is a desire for that kind of protein.
Great. Any other questions people had? Maybe I could jump in while people having further think. I find the data of these colonial nutritional scientists really fascinating, Megan. And I mean, it's kind of, you know, what the fact that they were looking at ecology in this kind of very expanded social sense, and kind of what was, you know, what were the kind of frameworks of thinking that lay behind that, and then whether that you see any approaches to examining those sort of wider ecological contexts of eating emerging in, you know, the kind of new areas of research around microbiome or metabolism, you know, the new science, if you like, this emerging. Is there any account of ecologies coming out in that new science as well? That was obviously...
I probably should read more of it, but my instinct is to say no, you know, that everything has become much more specialized and siloed. So this nutritional survey was in some senses a failure, because the war intervened, people fell out with each other, they didn't really ever produce a proper final report. There's a book written about this, so I didn't bother to go into detail about it, but it did include an anthropologist, Margaret Reed, included agriculturalists and nutritionists, medical doctors, and I think the most interesting person of all, but at the bottom of the sort of heap, was was a nutritionist, a woman nutritionist, who did much of the sitting with women and actually observing what they were doing, and was very interested in the wild food aspect of the diet. But I think, you know, there was much to, I mean, of course it was, you know, it's colonial research, so, you know, there are all sorts of like issues with it, but frankly, they're the same issues that we have today, many of them. I don't think things have changed very much in many respects. What I thought was interesting was the willingness of the director of the survey was someone called Platt, Benjamin Platt, who's very well known at the time as a nutritionist, and apparently was a very kind of overbearing, kind of bossy, big man type person. And Margaret Reed fell out with him, and there were all sorts of problems. But he was just seems very willing to have changed his mind on all sorts of things as a result of the data. And he became a very early advocate of fermentation. So in the 1940s, he's writing all these papers saying everybody should be fermenting their foods because this is really the ennoblement of food, as he put it. So it was interesting that they attempted, at least, there were all sorts of problems with data collection and their analysis, but at least they worked with the idea that you couldn't just look at nutrition. You had to look at agriculture, you had to look at ecology, you had to some extent look at history, and you certainly had to look at social organization. So I think, yeah, it was interesting. I'm just seeing in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is really the same period that Audrey Richards is carrying out her work in Northern Rhodesia, which I've also studied separately, and so it's very much part of the same move that came out of the colonial office in Britain, which was to look at nutrition. And I think what motivated them really was the perception that people were getting sicker, that, you know, for example, when in Malawi, when migrants were being recruited to go to work on the mines in South Africa, that were being weighed and measured, and it's a bit like when, you know, in Britain, when the recruits for the Boer War turn up and they're all sickly and suffering from rickets, that turns attention to nutrition amongst the working classes in Britain. It's a very similar kind of move here, which is, you know, a state of anxiety that people may be getting less healthy under British colonial rather than more healthy. And then you've got the mine managers and owners in South Africa saying, don't keep sending us these sickly men who we have to just repatriate. They're not, you know, they're not strong enough and good enough to perform the labor that we want from them. So there's a very direct link to, if you like, that more obvious colonial extractive process, which is you need able-bodied people, in which case you need women producing able-bodied people. So you have to go back to the rural areas to see what's happening.
Paul, did you want to follow that up, or I realize you didn't get a chance to ask the question directly?
No,
but
no, I think it's okay. I mean, she was already answering you. Audrey, you were already answering the question by Sarah,
Okay.
and then you looked at mine. So I think
they were connected, yeah.
yeah, they were totally connected.
Great. Any other questions or comments people have? I'm nearly at time, but possibly time for one more. Maybe I can ask as well, Megan, just about the role of the startups as well, in this interest in, you know, kind of, I guess, marketization of these, you know, kind of agroecological methods, whatever, and how that is being perceived within Malawi. I mean, are the startups coming from in Malawi, or are they basically, you know, kind of funded outside and, you know,
Well, as far as I know, there aren't any in Malawi. Though where they are in, definitely quite a lot in Kenya working with insects. So, and they're African initiatives, I think, to a large degree. I'm sure there is some external funding as well coming into them now, but some of these businesses are very much young African entrepreneurs. So there's some interesting, on the insect production, I know there's quite a lot happening in Nairobi, and I'm sure in other places too. On the growing meat, there are startups in South Africa. I've interviewed some people in Cape Town, a startup there, where they're doing they're growing meat in the lab. I think taking advantage of some degree of lack of regulation, but also that there's an interesting, there's a sort of idea, very much a conventional idea, that as Africans become wealthier and more modern, they'll want to eat more protein, and there's still a protein gap. I mean, this is very much disputed, and if you look at it in more detail, but there's a perception that there's going to be this huge, with the burgeoning of population, a huge protein gap in Africa, and how are you going to fill that? And in fact, the people who are running the meat startup that I spoke to initially it was started by vegans who wanted to encourage more vegan diets in Africa, and to discourage this kind of idea that as you became wealthier, you ate more meat, but then concluded that there was no way people were going to be persuaded to do that, and that therefore producing more meat in a more sustainable way was the way forward. So it's quite interesting.
yeah.
I'm just going to jump in quickly. So at the moment, Megan, is there the production of meat? Is meat being produced in places like Brazil, like you're saying, and being taken to Africa, or is this sort of the outsourcing or the sending, you know, the startups that have been influenced by meat production in other parts of the world? Just you mentioned earlier about the chickens.
Well, the chickens in particular, there's a huge, you know, the global Brazilian chicken thing is really big. And if you go into a supermarket in South Africa or Malawi, actually, a lot of the frozen chicken will be imported from Brazil. Not all of it, but quite a lot of it. And that's really, you know, that's really the middle class market is very much where they're focused. And I mean, it's big. I can't give you figures, but it's really.
But other meat is produced locally.
Other meat is produced locally, but of course, all African countries being asked to, and this is where it gets really uncomfortable, I think, being asked to meet climate targets, which, you know, and meat production is not good for their climate targets. You know, so I personally think it's completely unethical that Malawians with very precarious diets are being asked to meet these targets at all. But the government is, you know, is being influenced by this because they're very donor dependent. I mean, something interesting is happening at the moment, I think, which is there is another debt crisis in the region, including Malawi, a big debt crisis, which you could say is going to be the equivalent to the 1980s. But the creditors are different to some degree, and the Chinese are big creditors. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens as a result of this economic moment. But yeah, I mean, most people don't eat much meat at all. I mean, if you look at the surveys, it's very, very small amounts. Yeah. But they do aspire to eat more meat.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah.
Sarah, your microphone is off.
Thank you, Paula. Apologies. I'm just going to say that we're almost at time, and just to say that it's been really fascinating, I think, to have this historical perspective that really places this question of nutrition and metabolism within wider thinking about coloniality in the Anthropocene, which I think possibly in this series we haven't always situated food in quite in that way. So it's been really useful, I think, to do that. So thanks, Megan, for bringing that to our discussions and thinking. And thanks everybody for joining. The talk will be available, as Jenny says in the chat, on the website very shortly, and you'll be able to listen and download that as well. So thanks very much, everybody, and thanks, Megan, especially.
Thank you. Thanks so
Thanks
much.
very much, Megan.
Thank you. Good to meet you.
Thank you.
Thanks very
Bye.
much,
Megan. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.